When the floodwaters surged in, Keanu Reeves thought he had seen every kind of disaster Hollywood could throw at him. But nothing could have prepared him for this. Trapped in the heart of a deadly storm, with his dog Shadow fighting for breath beside him, Keanu's peaceful getaway turned into a fight for survival. As the water rose higher and higher, the world around him crumbled. With every wave that crashed against them, one question echoed in his mind: would they both make it out alive? What followed was a battle not just against nature, but against time, testing the strength of a bond that nothing, no flood, no storm, could break. When the floodwaters surged, Keanu Reeves thought he had seen every kind of disaster Hollywood could throw at him. But nothing could have prepared him for this. What started as a peaceful getaway with his loyal dog, Shadow, quickly turned into a nightmare. The sky, once clear, began to darken as a powerful storm rolled in. The winds howled through the trees, and the rain came down in torrents, slashing against the windows. Keanu rushed to get Shadow inside, but the water was rising fast. In a matter of minutes, the yard was swallowed up, turning into a churning sea. He realized, with a sinking heart, that the flood was more intense than anyone could have predicted. The ground beneath them became slippery, and the current was already too strong. He and Shadow couldn't control the situation anymore. The flood surged, crashing into everything in its path, tearing apart fences and sending debris floating past them. Keanu's eyes locked onto Shadow, who was struggling against the current, exhausted from trying to stay afloat. In that moment, he knew the worst had come. Shadow was fighting for his life, and Keanu wasn't sure if he could save him. The floodwaters rose higher and higher, and the fear of losing his best friend overwhelmed him. Without thinking, Keanu dove into the raging water, his hand reaching desperately for Shadow. But each time he moved forward, the current pushed them further apart. Keanu could feel his muscles burning, his body growing weaker with every desperate stroke. Shadow was still out there, just a few feet away, but the flood was relentless. Just when Keanu thought they were done for, he saw a piece of debris, a wooden plank, floating toward them. He grabbed it, pulling himself closer to Shadow. The storm raged on, the rain making it almost impossible to see. But Keanu couldn't give up. Not now, not when Shadow needed him the most. With one final push, Keanu reached Shadow. His hand grasped the dog's collar, pulling him up onto the plank. But the current didn't stop. It kept pushing them further down the street, knocking them against the remnants of houses and trees. Keanu clung to the plank with all his strength, but Shadow was still fighting for breath. The flood seemed endless, and with every minute that passed, Keanu's hope started to fade. He was exhausted, Shadow was exhausted, but they couldn't stop, not when they were this close to losing everything. Keanu pushed through the pain, using every ounce of energy to keep them both afloat. The bond between them was stronger than the water threatening to take them under. Finally, Keanu saw a flicker of light through the storm, a rescue helicopter in the distance. But time was running out. They were still too far from safety. Keanu had one last chance to save them. He glanced at Shadow, his loyal companion, and knew that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. As the storm continued to rage around them, Keanu and Shadow were determined to survive. They had come too far, fought too hard to give up now. The next moments would define whether they made it out alive or succumbed to the flood. But Keanu Reeves wasn't ready to lose the one thing that mattered most. Not today, not ever. The storm roared louder, as if it had come alive, determined to drag them both into its chaos. Keanu Reeves, still clinging to the plank, could feel his strength waning with every passing minute. Shadow was barely hanging on, his body trembling from exhaustion. Keanu's heart pounded as he tried to stay focused, looking desperately for any sign of rescue, any way out of the nightmare they were trapped in. The helicopter lights flickered once more in the distance, but they were still too far from safety. Keanu's mind raced, every second counted, and the relentless waters showed no mercy. He looked at Shadow, whose eyes were filled with a mix of fear and trust. The bond between them was undeniable, forged through years of loyalty and love. They were a team, and Keanu knew that no matter how dire the situation, they would fight this together. Keanu shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Shadow, stay with me, buddy." He tightened his grip on the dog's collar. As they were once again swept further into the flood, the debris around them seemed to have a life of its own, rushing by at lightning speed, threatening to knock them off balance. Keanu had to think fast. His only chance was to get closer to the streetlight pole he spotted earlier. Just a few feet ahead. He could see it now, its metal structure standing like a beacon in the middle of the chaos. With a burst of energy, Keanu pushed forward, one stroke at a time. But just as they were almost there, disaster struck. A large piece of driftwood came crashing into them, sending both Keanu and Shadow tumbling under the water. Keanu's heart stopped as he struggled to surface, panic threatening to take over. He searched for Shadow, his hands grasping at the water, praying to see his dog's face again. And then, just as quickly as the fear had consumed him, he felt it, a tug on his jacket. Shadow, though battered and exhausted, had managed to grab hold of him, pulling him back to the surface. Keanu gasped for air, his body trembling, but there was no time to rest. They weren't out of danger yet. Keanu pushed forward again, reaching for the pole. His hands finally gripped the cold, slick metal, and with everything left in him, he pulled himself up, dragging Shadow behind him. The world around them was still a whirlwind of rain, water, and debris, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they had solid ground beneath their feet. They had made it. Keanu collapsed against the pole, gasping for breath, Shadow panting beside him. They were both drenched, exhausted, but alive. Keanu looked down at Shadow, who met his gaze with a wag of his tail, a silent promise that they were in this together, no matter what. Before I share how this incredible journey ended, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever felt that unspoken bond with an animal, the one that goes beyond words, hit that like button, because this story might just make you believe in miracles. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Keanu and Shadow's fight for survival. Keanu's body ached, his muscles on fire as he gripped the streetlight pole, desperately holding onto the last sliver of hope in a world quickly being consumed by the flood. The storm raged around him, the wind howling like a beast on the hunt, and the rain fell in torrents, soaking him to the bone. Shadow, his loyal companion, lay at his feet, his sides rising and falling in shallow breaths. The dog was just as exhausted as he was, but there was something in those eyes, something that kept Keanu from giving up. The water continued to rise, creeping up the pole inch by inch, and with each passing moment, Keanu could feel the strength of the pole wavering. He looked around, seeing nothing but devastation. The town he knew, the town he loved, was disappearing beneath the water, consumed by the storm's fury. His heart pounded, the fear in his chest growing as he realized just how fragile their position was. He looked down at Shadow, whose eyes were fixed on him, silently asking for a plan, a way out. Keanu felt the weight of that gaze like a promise that they would survive this together. His mind raced, trying to think of a way forward, but there was no clear path, no way to know what would come next. He could feel the pressure mounting, the storm refusing to let up. If they stayed here much longer, they wouldn't stand a chance. With a deep breath, Keanu clenched his jaw and spoke, not to Shadow, but more to himself. I can't let you down, buddy. I won't leave you behind. Not now, not ever. His words felt hollow, even to him, as he knew the odds were stacked against them. But he couldn't allow himself to think about that. He had to keep moving. They had to keep moving. Suddenly, a faint sound pierced through the chaos, a rumble in the distance. The unmistakable sound of an engine struggling against the current. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. Was that a truck? Could it be a rescue team? Could they finally be saved? The rumbling grew louder, and for a brief moment, a spark of hope flickered in Keanu's chest. He looked toward the source of the sound, but through the storm, everything was shrouded in darkness. The truck was still too far away, and the flood was still too strong. Keanu's grip tightened on the pole. He couldn't afford to wait for a rescue that might never come. The storm was relentless, and the water was unforgiving. But what else could he do? What other choice did they have? He looked down at Shadow, his faithful companion who had never wavered, who had always been by his side, no matter the odds. Shadow's tail gave a faint wag. And in that moment, Keanu realized something. No matter how bleak the situation was, they weren't alone. They had each other. And that was all that mattered. Keanu's voice was low, his words only for himself as much as for Shadow. We're going to make it. Buddy, I don't care what it takes. We're getting out of here. But as the minutes dragged on, with the storm showing no signs of relenting, doubt began to creep in. The truck sounded closer now. But was it enough to save them? Or would the storm swallow them whole before they could reach it? The question hung in the air, unanswered. With one last effort, Keanu took a deep breath and steadied himself. We keep moving. We don't stop. We're not done yet. And with that, he pushed forward, determined to find a way out. Shadow, despite his exhaustion, followed closely behind, each step taken in perfect sync with Keanu's. They were a team, and together, they would face whatever came next. But the question remained, could they make it to safety before the flood claimed them both? Keanu's heart raced as he and Shadow pushed forward through the relentless flood. Each step feeling like an eternity. The water was rising faster now, sweeping away anything that dared to stand in its way. The truck that had given him a glimmer of hope was still somewhere in the distance. But the journey toward it seemed like an impossible dream. The weight of the storm, the raging current, and the sheer exhaustion were all taking their toll. Yet, there was something inside Keanu, a fire that refused to be extinguished. The thought of losing Shadow pushed him forward. Shadow had been by his side through thick and thin, a companion who had seen him through the darkest moments of his life. Keanu would not let this be the end of their story. They had made it this far, and he wouldn't stop now, not when safety was so close. The storm howled around them, the wind knocking them off balance. But still, they moved, Keanu guiding Shadow through the waters, using every ounce of strength he had left. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind sent a wave crashing over them, pulling Keanu under. For a moment, the world went black, and he lost his grip on Shadow. Panic surged through him as he flailed, fighting to reach the surface. His lungs burned, and every muscle screamed in protest. But he fought through the pain, refusing to give up. The storm seemed to close in around him, a suffocating force that threatened to drown him. Then, as if by instinct, Shadow appeared beside him, his strong body pressing against Keanu's side. The dog's claws scraped against the debris, his fur wet and heavy. But Shadow refused to leave him behind. Keanu gasped for air, his chest heaving as he reached out for the dog. "You're still here, buddy," he muttered, the words almost lost in the roar of the storm. "I knew you wouldn't leave me." Keanu managed to get his footing, using Shadow as his anchor. And they pressed on once again. The truck was getting closer, its headlights flickering through the darkness, cutting through the chaos like a beacon of hope. But they weren't there yet. Every step felt like they were being dragged back, the current relentless in its pursuit. As they neared the truck, Keanu's strength was nearly gone. His arms ached, his legs felt like lead, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Shadow, too, was slowing, his paws barely able to find purchase against the water. Keanu's mind raced, searching for any last reserves of energy to push through the exhaustion. "Just a little further, boy," he whispered through gritted teeth. "We're almost there, hold on." In a final burst of energy, they reached the truck. Keanu reached for the door, his fingers slipping against the wet handle. But finally, with one last effort, he managed to open it. A pair of strong hands grabbed his arm, pulling him and Shadow into the safety of the truck's cab. They had made it. Keanu collapsed against the seat, Shadow beside him, both of them drenched, battered, but alive. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment to breathe, to feel the relief wash over him. The storm was still raging outside, but they were safe. For now, the sound of the rain beating against the truck's roof was the only thing that filled the silence as Keanu rested his head against the seat, his eyes flickering open just long enough to look at Shadow, who lay beside him, exhausted but still loyal. "We made it," Keanu whispered, his voice hoarse. "We did it, buddy, together." Keanu's eyes barely stayed open, exhaustion weighing heavily on his eyelids. But he couldn't afford to sleep. Not yet. The storm outside still raged, the wind howling like a beast trying to tear through the world. But inside the truck, there was silence. For the first time in what felt like hours, Keanu allowed himself to breathe, to feel the warmth of the truck's interior. He glanced over at Shadow, who was curled up beside him, panting heavily, his fur still matted from the floodwaters. They had made it, they had survived, but even as relief began to settle in, Keanu knew it wasn't over. The floodwaters were still rising, still eating away at everything in its path. There were still lives to save, still more to do. Shadow's soft whimper broke the silence, his eyes looking up at Keanu with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You're right, buddy," Keanu whispered, brushing his hand gently over Shadow's damp fur. "We can't stop now. There's still more out there. We have to make sure everyone's okay." The words felt hollow, empty. Keanu knew that rescue teams wouldn't be able to reach the rest of the town without help. The storm had done its damage, and now, it was time for them to step up. Keanu's mind raced, thinking of what he could do next. He couldn't just sit here and wait. His thoughts turned to the local shelter, to the people who might still be stranded in the flood. There was no way to know how many had survived, how many were still in danger. The only thing he did know for sure was that if he didn't act, no one else would. He turned to Shadow, his eyes filled with resolve. "Let's go. We're not done yet." The words were not just for Shadow but for himself. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for something greater. It was about making sure no one else was left behind. The storm showed no signs of slowing, and Keanu knew the danger was far from over. But he couldn't wait any longer. He had a plan, and he needed to get moving. He opened the truck door, the cold wind biting at his skin as he stepped out into the chaos once again. The floodwaters had reached further, swallowing more of the town as time went on. But there was something else now, the sound of other survivors. The faint murmur of voices amidst the storm. There were still people out there. Keanu gritted his teeth, his hand gripping Shadow's leash as they pushed forward through the flood. Every step was a battle against the current, every inch harder to move forward. But Keanu refused to give up. Shadow stayed right by his side, his eyes sharp, his movements sure. They were a team, and nothing at all, could stop them. The storm didn't care about their resolve, and neither did the flood. But Keanu didn't care either. He had a purpose now. They had to get to the people who still needed help. He wasn't going to stop, not until the last person was safe. And Shadow would be there with him every step of the way. They made their way through the flooded streets, carefully navigating the debris, listening for cries for help. The water was waist-high now, and with every step, Keanu could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. But he pushed forward. There was no turning back now. They were fighting for the ones who couldn't fight for themselves. And as they approached the shelter, Keanu caught sight of something that gave him the strength to keep going. A faint light shining through the storm. A beacon of hope that reminded him of why he was doing this in the first place. Shadow's tail gave a faint wag, as if to say, "We're not alone. We're not finished yet." Keanu took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength he had left. The storm wasn't done with them, but they weren't done either. They would keep fighting, together, always. The journey wasn't over, not yet. Keanu's heart pounded as he waded through the water, the current pushing against him with every step. Shadow trotted beside him, his fur drenched, but there was no hesitation in his eyes. They were a team, bound by something unspoken, and neither would stop until the last person was safe. The storm was relentless, but Keanu had a goal now. He couldn't afford to let the flood win. He couldn't afford to let the town, the people who still needed him, be swallowed by nature's wrath. They pressed on through the debris-laden streets, the world around them distorted by the haze of rain and wind. The flood had left a path of destruction in its wake, half-sunken cars, overturned trees, and houses barely clinging to their foundations. Despite the chaos, Keanu's focus never wavered. His mind raced, calculating each step, each movement. There had to be others still trapped. He couldn't hear them yet, but the faint flicker of a light in the distance gave him a small sense of hope. They were close to the shelter, the place where people had gathered in hopes of survival. Shadow's ears perked up, his keen senses aware of something beyond just the storm. Keanu looked down at his dog, a silent nod passing between them. Shadow barked softly, his low growl a warning. Someone was close. Keanu's heart leapt. They weren't alone. They were getting closer. The water, now up to Keanu's chest, slowed their progress. His muscles burned, and the cold seeped deep into his bones. But there was no time to stop. The shelter was just a few steps away. A few more feet of resistance. He could feel the pull of exhaustion. But the thought of the people inside the shelter, of those who were depending on them, kept him going. Shadow, noticing the strain in Keanu's movements, pushed ahead, staying focused. The dog knew what Keanu needed, no words, just action. Together, they were more than just two beings fighting the storm. They were a force stronger than anything the flood could throw at them. Finally, they reached the shelter, its doors partially open, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as he saw people huddled together inside. Their faces a mix of relief and fear. They had made it. They weren't too late. But the storm was still raging. And time was running out. The floodwaters were climbing. And the shelter was no longer safe. Keanu knew they had to act quickly. He turned to the people inside, his voice firm and commanding despite the exhaustion that threatened to overtake him. "We need to move. This place won't hold much longer. I'll lead the way. Everyone, follow me. Stay close. We're getting to higher ground." The survivors, too exhausted and terrified to argue, nodded. Keanu took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. With Shadow leading the way, they navigated the treacherous streets again, pushing forward through the chaos, until they reached a hilltop that had somehow remained untouched by the floodwaters. The last of the survivors found shelter on the hill, their breaths shallow with fear but alive. Keanu and Shadow, drenched and broken from the journey, collapsed onto the ground, side by side. The storm still raged, but Keanu felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. They had done it. They had saved them all. Looking down at Shadow, Keanu whispered, "We made it, buddy. We kept them safe." And in that moment, Keanu realized that this was more than just a story of survival. It was a story of unwavering loyalty, strength, and courage. He had seen the worst nature could throw at them, and yet they stood together, stronger than ever. As the floodwaters slowly receded, and the storm eventually passed, Keanu and Shadow sat together, watching the sunrise. The world around them was scarred, broken, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered. Together, they had faced the impossible and had emerged stronger for it. It wasn't just the storm they had survived, it was everything. Thank you all for following this incredible story to the end. If you enjoyed the journey of Keanu and Shadow, feel free to comment with a 2 to let me know you liked it. If you feel like the story could have been better, go ahead and comment with a 7. Your feedback helps me improve and bring you even better stories in the future. Don't forget to share this video with your friends so they can experience this emotional story too. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the next amazing tales here on Tapestry of Worlds. Thank you again for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.